When we think of Ford of Canada, we usually think of Oakville. That's where Ford has made its Canadian headquarters for more than 70 years. But Ford has a proud history in several Canadian cities. So please join me as we travel across Canada and back in time to look at all the places where Ford built cars in Canada. Our first stop is Windsor, Ontario, 1904. Now, Windsor is right across the river from Detroit, which was rapidly becoming the center of the fledgling car industry. The oldest automaker in continuous operation in Canada is Ford. It was started by Gordon McGregor. He was the owner of the Walkerville Wagon Works. The firm had been started by his father. Now, the younger McGregor inherited the business when he was just 31 years old. He believed the automobile was the wave of the future. But rather than starting from scratch, McGregor thought it was a better idea to work out an arrangement with somebody already in the auto industry. So he made a trip across the Detroit River. He met first with Henry Leyland at Cadillac, and then later he visited with Henry Ford. Now, McGregor and Ford really hit it off, and they reached an agreement for McGregor to build Fords in Canada. The Evening Record newspaper in Windsor reported, "The old wagon works will be refitted and made into a factory for the manufacture of automobiles." The charter was issued on August 17th, 1904. That's considered the birth date of Ford of Canada. For Henry Ford, the deal meant access to the British Empire, except Great Britain and Ireland. He already had separate arrangements to ship cars to those countries, and they could be shipped to other Commonwealth countries duty-free, unlike cars made in the US. Now, for McGregor, the deal meant access to Ford designs and products, and soon Canadian-made Fords were being shipped to several countries, including Australia, India, New Zealand, and South Africa. In fact, in those very early days, exports from the Canadian plant outnumbered sales in Canada by a 3-to-1 margin. There were 16 employees working in the 3,400 square foot factory. In the first year, Ford of Canada turned out between 112 and 121 vehicles, according to Ford Archives. Ford saw tremendous growth, especially after the Model T was introduced in 1908, and you can see how dramatically sales took off. In all, about 760,000 Model Ts were built in Canada from 1908 to 1927. And for many Canadians, the Model T was the very first car they ever saw, they ever rode in, or they ever owned. Ford soon began making engines right in Canada rather than having them shipped over from the US parent firm. The number of employees of Ford of Canada increased from 1,500 in 1913 to 5,300 in 1924. By 1912, Ford of Canada was the largest auto manufacturer in the British Empire, and 2 new factories were soon built. Now, when the Depression hit, sales of Ford cars, all automobiles, really dropped off. That soon meant that employees were being laid off too. You can see here how quickly the employment fell for Ford of Canada. But things started to turn around in 1934. That's when Ford reported a profit for the first time since 1930. Ford spent more than $3 million to put up a new plant in Windsor in 1937. That was the largest industrial building constructed in Canada that year. With the outbreak of the Second World War, Ford of Canada had to switch to wartime production before its parent firm in the US. Civilian auto production was halted in early 1942. During the war, Ford in Windsor turned out bomber wings, landing gears, and military vehicles. After the war, Ford was one of the last holdouts in allowing workers to join a union. There was a bitter strike that began in September of 1945. Police often clashed with picketers during the 99-day strike. It was settled just a few days before Christmas. A bombshell announcement was made in late 1951. Ford announced it planned to move vehicle production to Oakville, just west of Toronto, about 300 kilometers east of Windsor. The main reason was to be closer to the main market area in Canada. Now, later on, I'll be telling you more about the Oakville plant. But Ford didn't totally abandon Windsor. Ford converted the Windsor facilities from assembling vehicles to building parts, including transmissions and rear axles. Ford spent millions of dollars upgrading its plants in Windsor. Then in 1981, Ford built another engine plant in Windsor called the Essex Engine Plant. The Essex Engine Plant was recently the site for a celebration for owners of Ford Mustangs. That's because the Essex plant is where the V8 5-liter engines for Mustangs are made. Now, many of you may know that yesterday marked the 60th anniversary of the introduction of the Mustang. It was back on April 17th, 1964. Now, to mark this occasion, Mustang enthusiasts gathered at the Essex plant in Windsor last weekend. There were more than 300 Mustang owners turning out. Some of them formed the number 60 with their vehicles. Ford demonstrated the value of operating a Canadian branch plant just across the river from Detroit. Other automakers also later set up operations in Windsor, and these included Studebaker, Chrysler, Pierce Arrow, General Motors, Packard, Hudson, and many more. Only Chrysler has built vehicles in Windsor for longer than Ford. For the first half of the 20th century, Windsor was the center of Ford production in Canada, and it all started at the converted Walkerville Wagon Works factory. The original Ford plant in Walkerville closed when operations moved to Oakville. Demolition of the Plant 1 complex was completed in 1970. Now, Ford requested that a historic marker be erected on the site as the birthplace of the Canadian auto industry, but that request was turned down. The Ontario Archaeological and Historical Sites Board said there were other automakers building cars in Canada before Ford. To meet the unprecedented demand for Model Ts, Ford built regional assembly plants across the USA, and these are just a few of them in places like Houston, Indianapolis, Los Angeles, and Milwaukee, and many more. Ford shipped car parts in crates to these various cities where they could be assembled in local plants. This concept soon spread to Canada. The first city in Canada outside of Windsor where Fords were assembled was London, Ontario, about halfway between Windsor and Toronto. Ford started assembling cars in a former car dealership in downtown London in 1913. But this facility was very small. In fact, it was so small, Ford had to lease a building at the fairgrounds to store their completed vehicles. So Ford decided it needed a larger assembly plant in London. In 1914, Ford built a new plant at 680 Waterloo Street. It cost $125,000. Like other Ford branch plants, this one was designed by Albert Kahn. He was one of the best known and most influential industrial architects. His designs always included lots of windows. After 10 years of making cars in London, Ford decided to convert the plant into a wholesale distribution center to serve about 75 Ford dealerships in southern Ontario. Now, one reason may have been that by the mid-1920s, Ford had larger assembly plants in Toronto, Montreal, and Winnipeg. Ford used this building until 1938, and then sold it to Pumps and Softwares Limited in 1945. It was later sold to the Siskines law firm, and extensive renovations were made to the building. In 2019, the building was sold to Drew Lowe Holdings, a real estate firm. Now, despite the interesting history of this building, it does not have heritage status and is not designated under the Ontario Heritage Act. In 1914, Ford began construction work on two plants in Canada's two largest cities, Montreal and Toronto. I want to first tell you about the plant in Montreal. Work progressed steadily throughout the summer of 1914, and it opened on Monday, November 2nd, 1914. The new plant meant jobs for 200 people. The policy at the time at Ford was to hire local people. The Montreal Star reported, "The new quarters of the Ford Company are a miniature reproduction of the large factories in Detroit." Here's a layout of the building. The first floor was the showroom and some offices. Then on the second floor, the lunchrooms and a parts area. The general repairs were done on the third floor, and the fourth floor is where the cars were assembled. The newspaper also said, "A feature of the building is the roof, where the cars are to be tested. A high wall surrounds the flat area to prevent any accidents, and the cemented floor makes an ideal practice court for the cars. The utilization of the roof for these purposes also does away with any excessive driving through traffic in the vicinity of the plant. Ford was in this new building only a few weeks when the Montreal Automobile Trade Association decided the new facility would be ideal for the second annual Montreal Motor Show. In all, there were 52 firms exhibiting a total of 230 cars. The Ford plant in Montreal had a huge impact on the local economy. For example, in 1930, Ford spent more than $1 million in Montreal to purchase materials used to make cars. And of course, on top of that were all the wages that were paid out. But as the Depression worsened, sales dropped off and employees lost their jobs. With the outbreak of the Second World War, Ford in Montreal soon began also making military vehicles. By 1942, domestic vehicle production was halted. No one knew it at the time, but this marked the end of Ford making cars in Montreal. Before the end of the war, Ford was renting out space in the building. Economic conditions, as well as manufacturing techniques and distribution methods, had changed dramatically after the war. It simply no longer made sense for auto manufacturers to operate a number of small factories across Canada. In the 1950s, this building was bought by Electrolux Canada, a manufacturer of home appliances. This former Ford assembly plant is still standing. Now it's known as Plaza Laurier. It's the home of several businesses, mainly government offices. Now, while that Ford plant was being built in Montreal, there was also work underway on another assembly plant in Toronto. The plant at DuPont and Christie Streets was 100,000 square feet and cost $325,000 to build. Ford started making cars in Toronto in December of 1914. When the Toronto Auto Show was held in February in 1915, Ford held the official opening of its new showroom and assembly plant. In newspaper ads, Ford said, "We will hold an open house from 10 a.m. until 10:30 p.m. each day and have arranged special entertainment features, including a motion picture show of the latest Ford films. Don't miss this chance to inspect our splendid new quarters." The highlight was the assembly area on the fourth floor. As the Ford Times magazine reported, one unique building feature will be the construction of the roof, which will be made heavy enough and paved with tile so that it can be used for testing cars. On the main floor was the showroom and executive offices. Today, a coffee shop now occupies what was once the showroom. As demand for Model Ts continued to increase, Ford soon needed a larger assembly plant, so made plans to move 11 kilometers to the east to Danforth and Victoria Park Avenues. In 1925, Ford sold its assembly plant for $250,000. Over the next 2 decades, this building was home to a variety of businesses. It was bought in 1948 by Planters Peanuts, which used as a factory until 1987, when production was shifted to Smiths Falls near Ottawa. Then a $12 million one-year restoration project was undertaken. A high-end coffee company, FEMA, bought the building in 1994. The corporate website says, located in what was originally the Ford assembly plant, the building has been fabulously redesigned, incorporating many of the original architectural features. This building is on Toronto's heritage inventory for its architectural reasons. On display in the building are 2 vintage Fords, paying homage to the original use of this building more than a century ago. So, Ford's first assembly plant in Toronto that turned out Model Ts is still standing. It's been restored to its original beauty. A little later, I'll tell you more about Ford's second plant in Toronto on Danforth Avenue, but that one didn't open until 1925. And first, I want to tell you about another Ford factory that was built during the teens. So let's head out west, Winnipeg, Manitoba. From 1901 to 1920, the population jumped from 40,000 to 180,000. That made Winnipeg the 3rd largest city in Canada, behind only Montreal and Toronto. Ford officials figured that building a plant in Winnipeg, about 2,000 kilometers northwest of Windsor, would reduce shipping costs. Ford built its new plant on the northwest corner of Portage Avenue, that's Winnipeg's main street, and Wall Street in what was then the city's West End. The sod turning ceremony was held in September of 1915. By the spring of 1916, the first phase of the building was completed. The Free Press newspaper reported, "The building is equipped from basement to roof with the latest machinery and appliances known to the industry, and as a result is a pleasant place for the workmen employed." The first Ford rolled off the assembly line in early 1917. By 1920, the plant was turning out 125 cars each day. There were 300 employees. Half of them were returned soldiers. By 1926, the plant reached its peak production when 25,000 vehicles were produced. The plant had 500 employees. They were earning $6 for an 8-hour day. Production was cut back in the early 1930s because of the Depression. With the outbreak of the Second World War, Ford of Canada was concentrating most of its wartime manufacturing in its plants in Windsor, Toronto, and Montreal. However, the Winnipeg plant produced a few aircraft refueling trucks for the Royal Canadian Air Force. The plant was shut down in 1941. Automotive production techniques were transformed during the war, and it made no longer sense to have several small factories across the country, so Ford sold its building to the Manitoba government, which converted it to the Manitoba Technical Institution. That's the forerunner of today's Red River Community College. The former Ford factory was later home to the Manitoba Textbook Bureau. The building was restored in the 1980s. It won a conservation award from Heritage Winnipeg. Today, this former Ford factory is known as the Robert Fletcher Building. It's named in honor of a teacher who later became Deputy Minister of Education. It houses various government offices. This building is a major part of the history of Winnipeg. For almost a quarter of a century, Fords rolled off the assembly line here for all of Western Canada. Now, let's go back to Toronto to the early 1920s. Work began on Ford's bigger plant at Danforth and Victoria Park Avenues in early 1923. The new plant was double the size of the old factory on DuPont Street. The Globe and Mail said, "Perhaps the most outstanding feature of the building is its excellent lighting. Each side is taken up by huge windows, while the light is also admitted through skylights in the roof." The new plant was described in the publication Contract Record and Engineering Review as the outstanding piece of industrial construction carried out in Toronto during 1923. Ford paid out more than $900,000 in salaries and wages to employees of 1930. During the 30s, as car sales dropped off, there were layoffs. By 1934, the total payroll was about half of what it had been in 1930. During the Second World War, the plant was used by the Army. After the war, Ford used it as a parts depot. But Ford was making plans to build a larger assembly plant in the Toronto area. So in the summer of 1946, Ford sold the plant to Nash Motors. At first, Nash used the plant to make parts. Then Nash spent $2 million to renovate the plant. Cars started rolling out again in the spring of 1950. The last Rambler left the factory in July of 1957. The car factory then sat empty until 1962. But then it got a new lease on life. The building was gutted, and $7 million was spent to rebuild it as one of the first enclosed shopping malls in Canada. It was built as the world's largest all-electrically heated and air-conditioned mall. In the late 1980s, there was a $10 million renovation to the shopping center. At the grand reopening, historical articles and photos of the buildings were on display. The Lowe's Home Improvement Store, now at Shoppers World, used to be the car factory. And if you look very carefully, you can still see the roof line from its days as an auto factory. Ford's second plant in Toronto that turned out Model Ts and Model As and later Nashes and Hudsons and Ramblers is still a vital part of the neighborhood as a shopping center. In fact, it's been a place to shop for almost twice as long as it was used to manufacture cars. Just after the new assembly plants opened in Montreal and Toronto, Ford was looking at building a plant on the West Coast. But it turned out this Ford assembly plant wouldn't begin operations until the late 1920s. In 1920, Ford moved into this building at 1160 Hamilton Street in Vancouver, where it established a provincial branch to oversee Ford dealerships and serve as a parts depot. With increasing demand for Ford products, the automaker began assembling cars in Vancouver in 1929. It acquired space in a building at 1020 Mainland Street, just a block away from its offices on Hamilton. This picture shows the Vancouver Ford assembly line workers on May 3rd, 1937. By the way, the building is still standing and is now home to a variety of restaurants and high-end specialty shops. Ford was soon looking to build a larger facility. This article on the front page of the Financial Post from March of 1931 says, Ford of Canada will build an assembly plant at or near Vancouver. It was announced by W.R. Campbell, president of the company. However, the poor economy of the early 30s meant Ford had to delay construction of its new plant. In December 1936, Ford finally announced it would build an assembly plant in Burnaby, about 15 kilometers to the southeast. A newspaper editorial said, the Ford people have been assembling their cars and trucks here for the provincial trade for the last 7 years. But the existing plant has become altogether inadequate to the demands of a business which, they report, shows prospects for next year of a bigger volume of sales than that of 1929, the last and greatest of the boom years. The new Ford plant in Burnaby opened in June of 1938. It was at 3850 Kingsway and was 77,000 square feet. The plant produced 35 vehicles a day. One newspaper said, it provides a payroll and adds to the purchasing power of the community. It is a good-looking and thoroughly modern plant. The newspaper added, Kingsway, which has been a rather drab street for some time, takes on a new aspect with the coming of Ford. Besides, the large investment in the plant indicates that one of the largest industrial concerns in the world has confidence in the future of Vancouver and British Columbia. On January 20th, 1941, the 20,000th Ford was produced in Burnaby. During the Second World War, the plant was rented out to the Department of National Defense and used to produce military vehicles. After the war, the Burnaby plant returned to car production in 1947. And that's interesting because Ford did not reopen its other plants in Montreal, Toronto, and Winnipeg. However, producing cars in BC was short-lived. In the spring of 1948, Ford announced it would be closing the Burnaby plant. Ford Executive Vice President Reese Sale said, it was somewhat of an experiment to reopen the Burnaby branch assembly plant a year ago. Experience in producing 3,000 vehicles here since April of 1947 has proved it would not be economically feasible to assemble the new 1949 models here. The building was then converted to a parts and accessories depot. Ford continued to use the building as a parts warehouse before selling it in 1960. In 1988, the building was demolished and the Station Square residential development was constructed on the site. These condos are part of Metrotown, an area of residential and commercial development. And right next to the site of the former Ford plant is the Metropolis at Metrotown, one of Canada's largest enclosed shopping centers. Now, let's go back to Southern Ontario and let's go to the 1960s. Ford started building a new plant near St. Thomas, just outside London. Work began in the summer of 1966. It meant taking over lots of farmland in the area. The decision to build this new plant was largely a result of the new Auto Pact. This trade agreement between Canada and the USA was signed in 1965. The Auto Pact meant cars and parts could move back and forth across the international border. It meant economies of scale. One plant could concentrate on just one or two product lines for all or most of North America. This huge new plant was 2.5 million square feet. Henry Ford II was on hand for the official plaque unveiling of the new St. Thomas assembly plant in June of 1968. At first, the plant produced the compact Ford Falcon. The plant later turned out the Ford Maverick, as well as its upscale Mercury version called the Comet. The St. Thomas plant turned out a variety of vehicles over the years, including the Pinto, Fairmont, EXP, and the Mercury versions. Starting in 2007, all of the large rear-wheel drive cars, like the Ford Crown Victoria, Mercury Marquis, and Lincoln Town Car, were produced only in St. Thomas. In total, this plant turned out about 8 million vehicles. The plant was closed in 2011, decommissioning began in 2015, and most of the plant was demolished in 2016. I visited the site a few years ago. This is all that was left. However, Amazon recently announced it's going to build what it calls a fulfillment center, really a huge warehouse, on this former Ford site. And late last year, Volkswagen announced it would be building a new multi-billion-dollar battery plant for electric vehicles in the St. Thomas area, not far from where Fords used to be made. Since the 1950s, Ford has been associated with Oakville, just west of Toronto. Here's the story of how the Oakville Ford complex came about. After the Second World War, Ford realized the number of cars manufactured in Windsor would really not be sufficient to meet the booming demand that was expected in the post-war economy. So top brass started looking as early as 1945 into the concept of building a huge new complex in the Toronto area. In the summer of 1951, Ford started buying farmland in the area. Construction work began in November 1951. Now, this project was expected to take 2 years, but construction proceeded much quicker than anticipated. Ford opened an employment office in March of 1953. Within a month, 5,700 people had applied for jobs. That was double the number of jobs available. And about 3/4 of these applicants already had jobs. But they saw working at Ford as a step up. The auto industry paid well. Wages started at $1.49 an hour for unskilled workers. There were also lots of fringe benefits. It was the largest manufacturing plant in Canada, and with an interior of more than 1.3 million square feet, it was the largest building under one roof in the British Empire. The official opening was held on May 11th, 1953. It started with a luncheon at the posh Royal York Hotel in Toronto for more than 100 journalists and Ford officials. Then they traveled to Oakville to see the first car, a gray four-door Ford Custom Line, driven off the assembly line. Ford of Canada President Rhys Sale told the crowd, "Canada is expanding in leaps and bounds, and that's why we are expanding too." In October of 53, the Oakville plant moved to 2 shifts. Office employees were moved from temporary accommodations in the plant into the new administration building. During its first year of production, the 3,000 employees at Oakville Assembly turned out more than 120,000 cars and trucks. By August of 1954, production of all Ford vehicles had been moved to Oakville, which brought an end to vehicle assembly in Windsor. Ford in Oakville grew in size over the years. Production also increased dramatically. Here's an indication of the changing auto industry and the impact of imported cars. In 1985, Ford of Canada produces 1 of every 3 vehicles in Canada. By 2006, Ford of Canada produces 1 of every 10 vehicles in Canada. The Oakville plant has produced a variety of vehicles over the years. It currently produces the Edge and Nautilus. Now, in 2020, Ford announced a $1.8 billion plan to convert the Oakville facility to produce electric vehicles and batteries for EVs. Work is scheduled to begin this year. Ford recently announced plans to build all-electric 3-row vehicles, but they're going to delay that from 2025 to 2027. Ford Oakville now has 3,600 employees. And by the way, the conversion to all-electric production also includes a name change. The Oakville Assembly Complex will be renamed the Oakville Electric Vehicle Complex. Now, there's one more chapter to the Ford of Canada story. Very briefly and very early on, Ford made cars in St. John, New Brunswick. Unlike the other Ford plants in Canada that I've told you about here, this was not part of a strategic plan, and actually, there was no Ford assembly plant built in St. John. Here's the story. In 1913, Ford was using a huge warehouse in St. John to store cars before they were shipped out to other countries. At the time, of all the cars that Ford made in Canada, more than half were shipped to other countries. Ford didn't actually build a warehouse in St. John. Instead, Ford leased two buildings that had been built to manufacture the new Maritime 6 automobile. The Maritime was an attempt to build a car in Atlantic Canada, but the firm ran into financial problems just as production was about to get underway. That left the owner with largely an empty factory. So this is where Ford rented space to store its cars waiting to be shipped across the Atlantic. Then disaster struck. Early one Sunday morning, March 2nd, 1916, a fire broke out on a ship docked in the St. John Harbor. The ship was from New Zealand and was preparing to depart. It took days to put the blaze out. Among its cargo, 500 new Ford automobiles in wooden crates. These Fords were later pulled out of the harbor and taken back to the nearby Maritime Ford facility with the idea of repairing them and then selling them. But it turned out they needed far more extensive work than simply letting them dry out. Essentially, they had to be largely rebuilt. As one newspaper reported, it was then that the company decided to put in an assembly line in this building, and a number of expert workmen were brought down from the factory at Ford, now Windsor, Ontario, to supervise the installation. The water-soaked cars were completely dismantled, dried, and cleaned. They were then run over the new assembly line, reassembled with new parts where necessary. These salvaged cars were distributed through the maritime dealers at attractive prices, and the demand for them was greater than the supply. Now, after these water-damaged cars were repaired and sold, Ford then found another use for this new makeshift temporary assembly line. A local newspaper reported in October of 1916, the plant on Rostaday Avenue will be devoted to use as an assembly plant. This will also involve the doing away with the garage and repair work formerly carried on there. Production of new cars is principally for the Australian market. These units were equipped with special tropical oversized radiators and auxiliary water tanks. Additional local employment was provided in the local manufacture of exporting shipping cases, each car shipped being crated in a large individual wooden case. Now, there are no production totals, although it was likely just a few hundred cars made in St. John. It appears from local newspaper coverage that the St. John assembly plant operated for only a few weeks. With the lease expiring, Ford then bought an older building in St. John as its regional sales and parts headquarters. And by the way, that old Maritime building soon became the local dealership for Willys Overland and White trucks. Ford continued to be an economic force in Atlantic Canada. In 1937, it announced it would build a new sales and service center for Atlantic Canada in St. John. In 1938, Ford set an all-time high amount of shipments through St. John with 46,000 cubic tons. Ford was the largest single industrial shipper through the port of St. John each month from January to April. The new facility was officially opened in March of 1939. Soon after the Second World War began, the Ford facility was used as a drill hall and lecture hall. Then in 1943, Ford turned over the building to the armed forces. After the Second World War, the plant was used by Ford for several more decades as a storage, parts, and distribution center for Atlantic Canada. Ford moved out of the building in 1994. Now, this building is still standing, and in recent years, it's being used for a variety of purposes, including temporary storage for the New Brunswick Museum and as a training facility for police dogs. And that's the story of the very brief time when Ford assembled cars in St. John, New Brunswick. And ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my presentation about all the places in Canada where Ford made cars. I used a variety of sources in my research, and I'd like to thank the following for their support on information and photos: Ford Archives, public libraries and archives in several cities, also daily newspapers from many cities, and the Elgin County Archives in Ontario, and two other people, Julian Branch and Will Chabun, who helped me immensely with packaging all of this information. So I was pleased to present it to you. Are there any questions?
Yes, there are. Thanks so much, Dale. That was wonderful. Just as people sort of write in, I had a question to start us off. Do you have a sense, when you read about the history of Ford, you get the impression of this sort of big industrial empire where they didn't just own car plants, they owned the mines and the lumber yards and the ports. Were there any of those kind of raw materials facilities in Canada?
Not that I've come across, but I know they certainly tried to have a lot of Canadian suppliers for everything from nuts and bolts and upholstery and glass. So there were a lot of Canadian companies that became suppliers for Ford over the years. And that happened fairly early on. As soon as they started making cars in Canada, they were always trying to source local parts. And I mentioned the one figure in Montreal where 1930, they spent more than $1 million, which was big money in 1930, in buying parts and equipment for the cars that they were manufacturing in Montreal. And this would be the same in other cities like Toronto, Vancouver, Burnaby, and Winnipeg.
Okay, thank you. Rhythm is asking, other than the recently opened Innovation Center in Waterloo, have there been any design or R&D centers run by Ford in Canada?
Not that I'm aware of, no. And certainly not back in this era of these plants.
Okay. David's asking about part production outside of Windsor, because the impression we got sort of that most of these branch plants were really just assembly, but was anybody else making, I'm not going to say engines, because I, to the best of my knowledge, that was only in Windsor, but other Ford components across Canada?
Not that I'm aware of. These plants were really assembling the parts, but as time went by, they were making more of the parts locally in each of these plants, but not some of the major components like the engines. I believe they were always just made in Windsor and then shipped across the country.
Tad has actually just asked a question I was going to ask. Do you know much about Ford's tractor production in Canada? I know this is a topic Alex and I have discussed covering in a future talk because it's a whole other world, but Fords and tractors.
As far as I know, they were made only in Windsor. I did not come across any indication that tractors were made in any of these regional plants. Doesn't mean they didn't happen, just means I didn't come across that information. The information I found was these branch plants were to produce cars for each of these regions.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know there was a truck version of the Ford Model T, the Ford Model TT. Do we have a sense of Ford truck production in Canada? I know they really ramped up during the Second World War, but what about before that?
Well, I know that the transition, when Oakville opened, the truck production stayed in Windsor for a year or two after Oakville opened, and eventually the truck production was transferred to Oakville. And of course, later on, I talked about the expansion of the Oakville facility. And of course, they built the big truck plant there to focus on trucks back in the 60s. Also interesting that Ford of Canada produced, unlike Ford in the US, there were Mercury trucks and Ford trucks. And of course, this is back in the 50s and 60s. But in the US at that time, you could only buy a Ford truck. Now, the Mercury trucks were very similar, other than the logos on the hubcaps and the trim on the side and a new tailgate that said Mercury instead of Ford. But that's another unique aspect of Canadian-made Ford products.
Another question from Rhythm. She's asking about the difference between sort of American and Canadian like original equipment manufacturers. Were Did Ford encourage their subsidiaries to open franchises in Canada? Were they looking sort of specifically for Canadian parts manufacturers? Like, do we see any of the kind of Ford its offshoot companies, like its parts and glass manufacturers opening up here, or was that all Canadian stuff?
I'm not aware of that. I really can't answer that. I haven't come across that in my research, so I don't have the details on that.
And Rhythm's also asked about sort of quality issues, but I'll broaden that. Can you tell us more about the differences, especially, I mean, the Model T is the obvious one because there's so many of them built, but what are the differences between an American and a Canadian made Model T?
Well, one thing was the colors. We've heard Henry Ford talk about, any color as long as it's black, but actually in Canada, they were offered in more colors than they were in the USA.
I may be able to fill in on this. We just got a question about Robertson screws, and I've been researching this subject. Yes, to the best of our knowledge, almost all the Canadian-made Fords used locally produced screws that were Robertsons, and I believe there were also some differences in the shape of things like tail lights and windows, very minor things, just based on what was available locally.
Yes, and I think that the recent video we have from 1923, we talk about some of those differences between Canadian and American ones.
Yeah, there were endless tiny variations. Even I think like the texture of carpeting they used, the stuffing for the upholstery. Very few big differences, but lots of teeny tiny ones. Mark is asking whether we know if Ford trucks ended up in the early factories or like the Montreal or Vancouver ones. Do we know if any of those were made out there?
I did not find any indication of that. I did not find that in any photos, but again, there's, that's part of research. You can always find out more, but I did not come across that in my research. What I found from these branch plants was they made cars.
Hendrick's asking about sort of online libraries of Ford material, but I guess just to broaden it out a bit, do you have any recommendations for Ford research material for people looking to learn more about the company that would be Canadian focused and publicly available?
Well, I mean, Ford has a public relations department, which is very, very helpful, and also a lot of public libraries and city archives have some great material, and that's where I got a lot of the material here. So that's also a great source. Local history room in your local public library or city archives, and also with interlibrary loans, you may be somewhere else but be able to get information from another library. So those are great sources, and Ford of Canada.
Mm-hmm. Jeff is pointing out the big Canadian and US Model T difference that we missed is, of course, the Canadian T's always had 4 doors because of the different sides of the road being driven on in Canada versus the United States versus the American ones that had 3 doors. Excellent point, Jeff. Thank you.
Right. And also because of the shipping
to
other countries. So, yes.
Tad just is looking for confirmation. So Oakville is currently the only place that Ford's actually producing vehicles right now, right? There are other plants making parts.
That's correct, yes.
Questions are pouring in, my goodness. Bill's wondering if you can speak to anything on Canadian, the production of military pattern trucks during the Second World War by Ford Canada.
Other than what I mentioned, the military production was largely focused in the Windsor area. And some of the other plants early on made military vehicles, and of course made them before the parent firm in the USA. I don't have a specific breakdown of which models were made at each of these plants.
That would be an excellent question, Bill, to go to the Ontario Regiment Museum, also in Oshawa, because they've done a ton of research on military truck production, and did actually their stuff was mostly focused on GM, but we did do a seminar with them on wartime production in Canada back in the day. David, as a source, is recommending the early Ford V8 Club of America as a reference point. And we can certainly speak to the quality of the Henry Ford Museum has a great research team and lots of good Canadian material on hand.
For sure.
Paul's asking if you know the sort of final fate of the Cardinal plant in St. Thomas. Forget if we covered that. I know we covered the St. Thomas plant, but
I'm not sure of the Cardinal plant.
give us more, Paul, and we'll get back to you. Peter's pointing out, would you mind scrolling back to the photo in the Burnaby plant that shows a car body being attached to a chassis? He has an interesting question about what vehicle they're working on. He says he's wondering if it's a publicity photo because it looks like a truck chassis with a car being lowered onto it. Peter, this probably was a staged photo for the media rather than the true production picture. That's often the case with these kinds of plants, but let me know what you think.
Is that the photo he was asking about?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and he's pointing out at the different suspension elements on the chassis than on the or on the rear axle than on the front axle that might indicate this is a truck chassis and not a car chassis.
It could be, and it could well be a publicity photo.
Yeah. One thing I've certainly noticed that you don't see in Ford photos that you do see in other car companies at the time is lots of other car companies. You see, you know, the middle management types in hats and fancy suits lurking in the background, and Ford seemed to have put in the work to make sure those never showed up. Oh, good question. Rhythm's asking if Ford made any specialty cars like head of state limousines, you know, the Lincoln limos that were owned by Roosevelt and Reagan. Did we have any sort of equivalent Canadian cars?
Not that I have come across. No.
Yeah,
But those are from Dearborn and were made in the USA.
Yeah. David, in going back to the chassis photo, is saying yeah, that is definitely a car cab being mated to a drive-away truck chassis for a press photo. You know, something to give the workers to do.
Could well be, yes.
Let me see.
I'll jump in while there's a pause, Dale.
Sure.
When they were planning the Oakville plant, did you run across in your research if there's any other locations that were being considered for the new assembly plant in Ontario?
No, it seemed that Oakville was the favorite early on. The reason for moving from Windsor to the Toronto area was simply population. And I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I think it was something like, I think it was 65% of the Canadian population was within 560 kilometers of Oakville, largely Toronto, of course. So that cut down on shipping because otherwise all of the cars had to be, or a lot had to be shipped from Windsor to the Toronto area. So that was a big reason for the move. And when you think General Motors was in Oshawa, just on the other side of Toronto, it may have made sense for Ford to be in the Toronto area. And that was the reason for the move. And simply to reduce shipping costs and keep costs down. So I have not come across other locations that they were considering. And when it did happen, it seemed to happen rather quickly when they announced they were looking at buying farmland, options on property, and within months they had bought the farmland and were starting to excavate for the plant. So it seems like they had this notion pretty early on. I came across nothing that there were, 5 or something or cities in contention for it, and somehow Oakville won out over all these other communities, which we sometimes hear when we hear of other plants more recently, plants in the 70s and 80s and 90s, when they were looking for sites like the Hyundai plant or the Toyota plants in Ontario, the Hyundai plant in Quebec. Often a lot of economic development work to try to lure these companies. And more recently, we've seen the attraction of battery plants. I mean, the Volkswagen battery plant that's going in near St. Thomas, where the Ford factory was. But yeah, it seems like Oakville was the early leader in the Ford sweepstakes starting in the 40s.
Okay, I'll jump in with a follow-up question. So with your previous talk, we talked about GM opening its auxiliary plant in Regina. So Sam McLaughlin chose Regina for Western Canada GM production. Why did Ford never move to Saskatchewan?
Well, they had a plant in Winnipeg, which is, Winnipeg's about 600 kilometers east of Regina. And they had a plant in Vancouver. And also the Ford plants had opened earlier. I mean, the Winnipeg plant in 1917, the first cars. The GM plant in Regina didn't open until 1928. And it was because GM was outgrowing Oshawa and needed somewhere else to put a plant. And if you were looking for all of Western Canada and not putting one in British Columbia, then Regina is more centrally located. So, and, for a long time, General Motors had the 2 plants, Oshawa and Regina, whereas Ford had this, more plants in Montreal, Toronto, Winnipeg, and Vancouver. So sort of a different business model of, do you want one big plant in the West? And if so, you want it more centrally located in Regina, or do you want more smaller plants across the country as Ford did?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dale. Do you have any? I have 8 o'clock on the dot right now. Do you have any final comments you want to, or?
I think it's just a lot of times we don't recognize the economic impact these various plants had, and also the buildings. I mean, all of the buildings are still standing, all of these former Ford factories, except I'm not sure about the one in St. John, New Brunswick, if it's still there or not, but it was until very recently. The new facility they built in the late 30s, I'm not sure about where they manufactured cars temporarily, if that building's still there. But the others, the ones in Montreal, both of the ones in Toronto, the one in Winnipeg, and they're all still standing. And the first assembly plant in Vancouver is still standing. The only one gone is the Burnaby one. So these had a tremendous economic impact in their day, and 100 years later, all except the Burnaby one are still very beautiful and important buildings in these communities, yet most people don't know about it, that there used to be a car factory there. So there's a lot of other car factories in Canada too. And I don't mean the small ones where they turned out, a dozen vehicles, but in the Quebec area, Montreal area, a GM plant, a Renault plant. So there's more car factories in Canada, or there's a bigger history of car factories in Canada than we may realize. It's not just Southern Ontario as it is today.